What is happening, AP Human Geographers? Mr. Majewski, and I am back for Unit 6. This is going to be the 6.2, so Unit 6, Subtopic 2. I'm going to try this again. I was about halfway through this video, and for whatever reason, my computer decided it did not want to record any longer. So we're back again. We're going to try it again, and hopefully we have more success this time. Hopefully we'll have as much success as cities have had in growing and developing in modern times. How about a segue there, huh? And we are going to get right into this presentation. One thing about this one, I know this is a video lecture. I'm actually going to play a couple of short videos in here as well. So at various times, we're going to go to that video. Now, if you don't want to play the video during the lecture, skip over it. You can always watch it on your own. I'll include the links in the comment section underneath. Okay, let's start. So you might ask yourself, why are we starting with an image about development and trade if we're talking about urban geography and city land use? Well, I just want to refresh your memory here with this world map. Now, yes, it's a trade and development map. Yes, it specifically kind of divides the world up like the Wallerstein theory, the world systems theory does, into core, periphery, semi-periphery. The whole point of this map is to remind you where the developed regions of the world are. We know they're North America, we know Europe, we know Oceania. Japan is an area of development within East Asia. And we can see the areas that are considered, I guess we'll call them high developing. On this map, they're really listed as semi-periphery. Those would be the purple-colored countries, Brazil, Mexico, China, India, as an example. And then we have the red colored countries, which we'll call medium developing. Those are in the developing stages and they're at the medium levels. And obviously we want to really hone in on sub-Saharan Africa. We want to hone in on Central Asia, Southeast Asia. We also want to hone in on portions of Latin America. Okay, so with all of that being said, we are going to move right into a list of the top 10 largest cities. And this is given to us by the United Nations. So we're going to use their data for city size, for population. Now, this is the 2018 list. All right, so a couple of years old, but it's relatively on point. And what you see here is Tokyo, Japan, by far number one largest city in the world, almost 38 million people. Delhi in India, you'll see a couple of another Indian city down lower as well, Mumbai. So India has two cities that are over 20 million, including the second largest. That doesn't surprise anyone, right? Obviously, India's second largest country, 1.4 billion people. We would expect it to have some really large cities. So we would with China, and number 3 is Shanghai, right? That's the largest Chinese city. You'll notice Beijing is on there as well. And India and China both have a bunch of cities in the 11 to 20 range, right? Like the next list, I guess you could say. Some other countries or cities as well that you want to notice: Sao Paulo, Brazil. You'll see Mexico City there. You'll see Cairo in Egypt, of course, over 20 million. You see Dhaka, Bangladesh. And then you'll see Osaka, Japan, so 2 Japanese cities. So right away, I want you to notice something. I showed you that map a little bit ago because I wanted to point out to you only the 2 cities in Japan are located in developed areas, right? So 8 of the 10 largest cities in the world are located in developing regions. That's not a surprise. There's a reason for that because they're rapidly industrializing. You'll also notice most of the large cities and most of the growth that's occurring around the world in cities is happening in developing regions. If that wasn't evidence enough, let's take a look at what the numbers look like in 2030. Now remember, that's just 12 years from that last map and chart that we looked at. So it's not a huge difference in terms of the rankings. Like, for instance, Delhi jumps to 1, Tokyo drops to 2. What you're going to notice is Osaka's gone, right? It's been replaced by Kinshasa in the DRC. And so what that means, folks, is that we have 9 out of the top 10 cities by 2030 are in developing areas. And why are we seeing those trends? Why do we see so much growth in developing areas? I think the whole entire class has really tried to reinforce these ideas. Population growth, which is occurring predominantly in developing areas. plus industrialization, right, which obviously causes mass movement towards cities and away from rural agricultural lifestyles, plus globalization, right, which is causing there to be more connection, more movement, more interaction, and more worldwide global trade, right, which is all leading to urbanization, the growth, the development of cities around the world. It's happening at a much more rapid rate in developing countries. We know that because, well, this process already went through most of its stages in developed ones, right? The United States, technically the very first, first signs of industrialization were already starting to emerge in the 1810s, 1820s. Really doesn't take shape until the 1850s and 60s. But full industrialization isn't achieved until World War I, World War II, the period in between. So it takes over 100 years for the U.S. to industrialize and to go through this urbanization process. Even when we were industrializing, it took us about 60 years before more people were living in cities that were living outside of them. Okay, so it's a long process. Developing countries are going through that at a much faster rate because they are industrializing at a much faster rate. And so that's basically the crux of it. Really quickly, we want to take a look at a couple of terms we have for especially large cities. A megacity first. A megacity is any city that has 10 or more million people. So you'll notice every one of the cities on the list here is a megacity. A metacity is a newer term. That's a city that has at least 20 million people. And so you'll notice by 2030, everybody on the top 10 list is a metacity. 2018, most of them are, and the ones that are not are very close, but I mean, technically, there were only 7 metas at that point. Okay? Just know these classifications. Obviously, these cities have they're in kind of a unique club, and they have a lot of unique opportunity, but of course unique challenges as well. Really quickly, we're going to watch like a 30-second video, I'm not even kidding you, about these mega cities that kind of introduces us to the changes that have occurred with them since 1950.
In 1950, New York and Tokyo were the only so-called megacities, cities with more than 10 million inhabitants. By 1980, these were joined by Mexico City, Sao Paulo, and Osaka. In 2010, there were over 20 megacities spanning almost every continent. Today, there are 32 megacities. Urbanization is happening faster than at any time in human history. Asia accounts for over half of today's megacities. By 2030, nearly 9% of the world's population will live in 41 megacities. But it's in Africa where some of the most rapid urbanization will take place in the future.
Okay, so again, hits on a number of key topics here, right? 32 megacities as of right now, up to 41 by 2030. You'll notice a huge number of them are located in the developing world, and specifically within Asia. Look at how many by 2030 are in China and India alone. All right. However, Africa is actually supposed to be industrializing and urbanizing faster than any other continent at this point. And so we'll actually see the fastest city growth occurring within African cities. Lagos, Nigeria is a really good example of that we will be looking at. You can expect Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You can expect Nairobi in Kenya to follow that path, and obviously Cairo in Egypt already has. So anyways, let's get back to our slides. I loved that short little intro. I thought I did a good job of explaining how things have changed very rapidly and how we're industrializing faster than ever before. Okay, really quickly, I love this image. This comes to us from the UN as well. So what we see are the megacities as of 2018. They're in the dark purple. All right, and again, are they clustered in the developing world? Yes, they are. However, we're seeing a good representation from the developed world at the same time. Now, What you'll notice here is the light purple colored circles. Where are they popping up? And that's by 2030. Suddenly we have these new megacities, all but one of them or all but a couple of them. It looks like two of them are in the developed world, the rest are in the developing. So this trend, this pattern is going to continue. Asia is going to be the center of a lot of it, but the greatest growth in Africa. And of course, we call this change, this difference that occurs. Remember, the international line of labor, the new international line of labor, divides the world into what they call the global north and the global south. The global north is the developed world. The global south is the developing world. And so when they refer to these terms, you're noticing almost all of the megacities popping up in the developing world. That's good possibility and opportunity for there. It also presents a lot of challenges, right? Especially since, resources and capital, they may be more strained, more stretched in a developing country situation. Anyways, good stuff. Most of the fastest growing cities we mentioned are in the developing countries. So one of the things we notice with developing countries is that they grow so quickly, especially as they urbanize, I should say industrialize and urbanize. Often there are major housing shortages, so much so that people begin to build dwellings on the outskirts, on the outer edges of town. These are known by different names in different places, but we tend to refer to them as informal housing or informal settlements. These are usually shanties, right, or temporary housing. However, a lot of it, since it's been used for so long, develops a semi-permanent or a permanent place on the outskirts of the city. Oftentimes, entire neighborhoods and sub-cities of informal housing pop up along outer edges of developing cities in developing countries. Anyways, let's take a look again at some megacities, some specifics. They're going to highlight some examples for you to see different characteristics about. Okay, this is only a 3-minute video, so let's get this baby playing as well.
Do you live in a megacity? Yeah, that's a real term. It's used to describe a metropolis with over 10 million residents. Right now there are 28 megacities in the world with about 450 million inhabitants among them. The most densely populated areas can have an average of more than 100,000 people per square mile. So what are some of the largest cities in the world? Well, when we talk about largest cities, we're usually talking about the number of inhabitants. There are many organizations that rank cities, but for this video, we're relying on 2014 data from the United Nations. Cities in Asia have dominated the top 10 list for a long time now. On the very top, by a long shot, is Tokyo, Japan, with about 38 million people. Tokyo has been the most populous megacity since about 1955, and it will likely remain that way until sometime after 2030. After Tokyo, 3 other Asian cities dominate the top of the ranks: Delhi, Shanghai, and Mumbai. Out of all the people living in urban areas in the world, 53% reside in Asian cities. Before Tokyo grew so large, New York City in the United States was the most populous city from the 1920s to the 1950s. However, today, NYC barely makes the top 10 list. To the south, Mexico City in Mexico and Sao Paulo in Brazil comprise other non-Asian metropolises. The world's largest cities are sometimes measured in terms of population density and land size. Asian cities, again, are at the top of these rankings. City sizes in square miles tend to vary dramatically, but China's Shanghai and Beijing are reportedly among the largest land-wise, as is Pakistan's Karachi. Then, cities like Manila in the Philippines and Dhaka in Bangladesh reportedly have some of the highest population densities in the world. Dhaka, according to a report by Demographia, has more than 15 million people living on just 139 square miles of land. And that breaks down to about 100,000 people per square mile. For the past 6 decades, urban cities like these have seen unprecedented growth. In 2007, for the first time ever, the global urban population outnumbered the global rural population, and the trends are expected to continue. By 2050, the UN predicts about 2/3 of the world will be living in urban cities, and by that time, there could be 13 additional megacities prospering around the globe. Languages like...
Okay, love that. So again, really reinforcing, where are we seeing real urbanization taking place? Well, all over the world, right? But predominantly in the developing world, especially in Asia up to this point. You heard her say right around 2000 is when the global majority moved actually into cities, right? And by 2050, 2 out of every 3 people will live in a city. So we just recently have seen this shift where more people living in urban areas than in rural, and that trend obviously is gonna increase, and it's gonna increase at a very rapid rate. Okay. Anyways, let's get back into the presentation. Again, love that video. Thought it was a very good one. Oops, wrong button. Let's go back into the presentation again. Okay. So what actually constitutes a city? Well, any urban area that has 50,000 people in it is considered to be a city. If you have 500,000 or more, you're considered to be a metropolis. All right, you've reached to the level of metropolis. Now, when multiple metropolises grow to the point where they overlap and they extend into one another, so that you have essentially a united urban area that just goes from one large area to another because all the metropolises have grown together, we call it a megalopolis. All right. A megalopolis example would be the northeastern United States. From Boston down to Washington, D.C., there is essentially entire urban built-up area that stretches connected through that entire region. And so you can actually travel or transport your way through that, and it's essentially through urban areas almost or the entire way. We're talking about hundreds of miles, okay? That is a megalopolis when cities essentially grow together into one massive, massive urban area. Another good example of that is in Japan. Japan, we see that as well. Tokyo, Osaka is considered another megalopolis. Urban areas that have essentially grown into one massive urban region. All right, now we still have different cities in them, right? But the cities and the other urban areas around those cities have essentially merged together into one uniform urban region. Okay. How are urban areas in the U.S. expanding? Well, they're expanding in ways that are different than the developing world. And the reality is U.S. cities are very different from European cities. We're going to see this in example a lot this unit. So one of the things we're seeing in the United States, especially beginning in, the mid-1900s, but all the way up until today, is something called urban sprawl. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It's growth outward from the original city that oftentimes can go seemingly in an uncontrolled way or maybe a partially controlled way. Developers continue to build, and the city continues to approve buildings, especially residences on the outer edges, that just cause the city to sprawl and sprawl and sprawl and sprawl. You're going to see some examples of this in the presentation. You're also going to be doing an assignment where you'll take a look at this as well. One of the reasons that this is allowed is because the United States is notorious for having cities that approve a lot of development. Because that allows them to potentially expand to their boundaries, and that allows them to potentially collect greater tax money and more revenues, especially since many Americans, wealthy, middle class, and upper Americans, prefer to live on the outer edges of cities. It makes sense that cities want to expand outward to take advantage of those higher incomes to tax. Anyways, we're going to look at an example of this unique type of expansion occurring in a lot of American cities. Now, this is more of a modern problem, and it's very much an automobile-based problem. And so the United States, much more automobile-dependent than other countries, seems to experience this problem a great deal more. Let's specifically get into this issue that they are experiencing. Let's go to this video. It is a little longer. It's about 8 minutes long. Okay, let's get right to it. Bang.
It's the capital of sprawl. Look in the dictionary, it'll say see Atlanta. Rectangle, riveted
it up, giving it up, yo, we living it up.
In the late 90s, Chris Weinberger actually referred to Atlanta as the fastest growing human settlement in the history of the planet.
Atlanta is the poster child of suburban sprawl, and it's everywhere. It's as far as the eye can go.
Atlanta's been a classic example of the drive till you qualify, affordable model where the cheap land, cheap housing is out at the edge.
This is a metro region where only 10% of the population lives in the city proper. 90% lives in the outlying towns and communities.
Extremely long commutes. The average employed Atlantan drives 66 miles a day.
Got a question for you. I'll put it down with efficiency. I think you want places.
There are no natural boundaries to stop Atlanta's growth. There are no mountains, there are no major oceans, and so there's nothing to say that we just won't sprawl to the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, it's like never mind Charlotte and the rest of the cities in this way. Atlantans every day drive the distance cumulatively that would take us to the sun and partway back. Every single day. All of those cars burning lots of gasoline generate lots of pollution.
As a matter of fact, in 2009, Forbes magazine rated Atlanta the most toxic city in the country. I'm breathing secondary smoke. No, I'm not talking about cigarettes. I'm talking about cars.
We know more and more that both ozone and particulate matter are major hazards to respiratory and cardiovascular health. But that's not all. We know that being in a car is one of the most dangerous microenvironments we've got. Car crashes are the major cause of death among young people in this country.
It's not just riding in a car that's dangerous. All over Atlanta, you see folks trying to get across 8 lanes of traffic, 1 lane at a time, like some sort of morbid version of the game Frogger.
It takes a lot of spiritual within to believe that the angels really got you covered.
3 pedestrians are struck by automobiles every week in Atlanta. 60 people were killed by cars while on foot in 2008. Over 1,000 people were injured. There's more than one Atlantan in a week who's killed by a car because of the way we built the city. Margaret Mitchell, the author of Gone with the Wind, was killed crossing Peachtree Street, hit by a car.
Several things happened kind of all at once that introduced me to new urbanism, and somebody mentioned this book by Andres Duany or something, they mispronounced his name. So I bought Suburbanization, read it in a night, and I just got hooked. What you have to do to become a developer, you just have to say you are one, and you are one. So we stepped in, held a charrette at the very end of '01. 02 was about permitting, and '03 was about infrastructure, and I think it was '04 when we started finally building the buildings, and here in 2010 it's mainly done. My name is Kevin Clark. I'm a partner with Historical Concepts. I'm an architect, a lead AP, urban designer. My background here is that I've been living here for about 4.5 years and have been working here for about 3.5. Menlo Park is so unique. It's right here in town. We're 1.5 miles from the state capitol. Every resident has a place to grab coffee, grab a bite to eat. My 200-foot walk to work is pretty unique, I would say, among Atlantans and probably most folks. Prior to this, I was actually commuting about 35 miles one way to the office. One of the great things is the happenstance.
occurrences. It's running into my neighbor as he's getting home from work and walking into his condo. And he says, "Hey, do you want to grab a beer later tonight?" Or, "Hey, we're playing trivia at the Mexican restaurant. You want to come and grab an enchilada and have a beer?" Absolutely. If I live more of a suburban lifestyle, if I would pass one of my neighbors, the way I would say hi to him is by honking in my car. Think about the difference of honking your car at somebody versus waving and saying hi, have a conversation with them, and so on and so forth.
To me, the key concept is walkability. And what makes for walkability? Well, one thing is there has to be somewhere to go. So that means compact, and your destinations aren't too far away. It means there's a mix of different elements, a park, recreational facilities, and it's an empirical fact that for a place to be walkable, it has to be interesting and beautiful, and clearly it has to be safe. Safe from crime, and even more importantly, safe from the damn cars. And so getting the whole street geometry thing right becomes incredibly critical.
If you drive down some of the subdivisions that we would associate with sprawl, you often find snout houses where the garage is really what projects out from the body of the house, and the garage is the most visible thing. It looks like cars live there. Back behind the garage, maybe you find the front door to the house. Whereas if you go to places like Glenwood Park or more traditional neighborhoods, you see porches that are not for cars, they're for people.
Garages are in the back that allows you to keep the trash and the kind of ugliness off the street. And really what it does is it gets you to use your front door a lot more. Here, I probably know 5 or 6 people within the first day. And I continue to know my neighbors. I know their families, I know their stories, I know their jobs, they know mine.
Great neighborhood, very convenient to everything.
There's always somewhere to go eat, someone to talk to.
I think the actual design is more of a community-based design where you have your retail, your food, and all that stuff contained within a small area versus suburbia where you have to drive maybe 2-3 miles to get to your favorite restaurant or the closest restaurant, I should say, maybe not even your favorite.
Neighborhoods like Glenwood incorporate many of the features that we increasingly recognize promote good health. More physical activity, more social interaction, helping to build community, also something that's very good for health. Less driving, which improves air quality. Less driving, which reduces the risk of being in car crashes, and so on. So this is an example of a neighborhood design that incorporates many strategies that really are public health strategies.
I did clock it when I first moved here. I lost 10 pounds in the first 6 months that I lived here. Didn't change my diet, didn't change anything. It was just a different way of living.
Okay, so what I liked about that very short clip, and that's actually from a series, right, that focuses on American cities being redone, is that it explained, hey, Atlanta is a good example of a city that is experiencing a lot of sprawl, right? A lot of expansion outward. And sprawl is oftentimes associated with suburban sprawl. What you're seeing is housing divisions, new ones, housing developments that are built on the outer edges. These are usually larger, they're usually newer, and they usually attract middle and upper class residents and families. And so what you see is continual growth outward of more and more of these subdivisions that just really feels like the city begins to expand and expand and expand. And it's all based on being able to access cars, right, and drive into the city and around the city as well. Well, the second half of this video really talks about an alternative to that, right? Something known as smart growth that we'll look at as one solution to sprawl, which again really focuses on building tighter, closer communities focused on walkability, not a lot of access to cars, to automobiles, a lot more walking around, a lot more interaction with your neighbors, and mixed use where you'll have retail and restaurants on first floors and then maybe residences above it as well. Okay, so I liked it because it gave you a good contrast between the two. Let's go back and investigate sprawl a little bit more. We're going to be taking a look at that. You can see a great image of that here on this slide, where it feels like American cities oftentimes just go on and on and on and on. Now, Where we're at in Anaheim, we may not be able to notice sprawl as often, right? Because we're already in an urban area. But I assure you, many of the residences that are in Anaheim originally were part of the original sprawl that took place in the mid-1900s, out from Los Angeles and other places. Now, if you've been into or around, for instance, parts of Anaheim Hills, or Yorba Linda, or Brea, especially as you get into kind of outside of the cities themselves, you'll see residential neighborhoods that are built maybe up into the hills that can go on and stretch on and on. That's a good example of sprawl, of newer sprawl that we're seeing. And it continues to occur in Orange and in other areas out towards kind of the less inhabited areas. All right. Anyways, let's take a look at some other examples of how cities have really grown outward as a result of this sprawl. Well, we've already mentioned sprawl. Suburbanization, I think I've already talked a little bit about that, but we're going to focus in more on it in the unit. And then another more general term we use called decentralization. And decentralization can take the form of a lot of different things. We're going to focus on edge cities, exurbs, and boomburgs. Okay. So sprawl is the outward growth of a city from the central area, right? And again, it occurs for different reasons in developed area in countries. It occurs for different reasons in developing. We see it in developed countries in the United States more than we see it in other places. All right. In developing countries, we see it in almost all developing regions, but they're for very different reasons. All right. So let's take a look at a bit on some maps here. Obviously, the gray area would be your built-up area. So we're looking at Beijing, China here. Obviously, some massive growth in Beijing. There's been economic reforms. There's been, obviously, political reforms that have led to economic reforms, I guess, is a better way of saying it. And they've embraced more capitalist policies, and that's led to just ridiculous growth. Look at Beijing in 1978. Look at the gray areas and how far they stretch outward. All right. That's 2000, just 22 years later. That urban expansion is so visible. The dark gray, right? And then now look at all of the lighter color gray. And then look at how far it expands really throughout the entire length of the map. What about Delhi? Remember, in India, they were at 4.5 million in 1975. By 2000, boom, right? 12.4 million. Much more expansion, right, outward, and you also saw a lot of darkening, which means a lot more density happening in the city itself. Dhaka, Bangladesh, right, 2.5 million in 1977. Let's take a look at now. Wow. Right? Look at that growth. That is massive, massive growth and expansion. We can call that sprawl, right? But not suburban sprawl, right? Like is occurring in the United States. This is oftentimes the result of fast industrialization and massive amounts of people to a city very quickly. The United Kingdom, right? Probably should have kept this in my other more developed groups here. But having said that, you can see how the UK has definitely grown as well. Look at Brazil. This is Brasilia. All right, Brasilia was kind of a planned city, so it was only developed in the 60s. Look how small it is here, right? And then boom, this entire region, all right, fills up with growth, with small areas and cities around, satellite cities as they were called. What about Mexico City? Right, look at Mexico City, 1973. Look at that city by 2000. Look at how dramatic that growth is, right? And then look at this. I love this time-stamped, right? 1929, now 1941, 59. That's a growth of a megacity. Just steady, rapid, massive growth. But you see as it industrializes how quickly it takes place in so many different directions, affected by site and situation. Now, in developed areas, as I've mentioned, growth occurs more because of suburbanization. That's when people leave the central city neighborhoods. They move to the outskirts or the suburbs. This is mainly an American idea. We don't really see it in Europe. We'll look at the reasons for that. The biggest reasons or causes for suburbanization are automobiles, making them available, making them cheap, so that Americans can afford them. The more you're able to afford automobiles, the more you're willing to live outside of the city, and suburbs boomed during and after World War II because of the advance of automobiles. Also, Right after World War II, the government developed some policies that really allowed many Americans to be able to afford homes for the first time. It was known as the GI Bill. It gave low interest rates for veterans after World War II, while millions and millions of Americans had served, and so it was a ticket for many Americans to buy a home, their first ever. Many chose these brand newly built suburban homes that had been built. They were seen as ideal. Additionally, the government built a highway system through the Highway Act of the Interstate Highway Act in the 1950s that built our major highway and freeway system that made it easier for folks to access city centers, which caused them to live further out. And finally, Americans became more considered prefabricated homes in the suburbs. These are pre-designed homes with that come with already pre-designed designs that you can choose from. They began to be seen as more ideal. They were newer homes as compared to older dwellings in inner city areas. They were usually on larger pieces of land with front and back lawns and yards, which wasn't something that folks had oftentimes in the city. They were quieter. They were seen as having less crime. They oftentimes had newer parks and services. They also had newer schools oftentimes. And so even within Hollywood and on television and early sitcoms, these suburban homes, these subdivisions, were really idealized as the ideal American dream. And so social and cultural norms really pushed movement outward, especially by white Americans. They were viewed as allowing for more individual freedom, less restrictions, lower taxes, and again, less pollution as well, since many inner city areas dealt with industrial pollution more. Obviously, less overcrowding. Well, these suburbs tend to be built on the outer edges of American cities, and newer versions just continue to be built further and further and further outward past where the last ring of them was built. If you look at the density of American cities, which is how many people there are, right, for every square mile, you'll notice the density gradient, right, which is, are you getting less dense as you move away from the city center, is massive. U.S. cities tend to become less and less dense as you move away from the city center. European cities, opposite. All right, so this phenomenon is known as the density gradient. And again, look at what we notice here. This image over time, 1900, 1930, 1960, 1990, shows you the number of people per square mile in and around the city center. In 1900, most folks are walking, all right? And so they must live near the city center in order to access jobs and other services. By the 1930s, we're starting to see automobiles, right? Streetcars, even some train activity, which allows folks to live a little further outward. But many still can't afford those or must live close to the city center. By the 1960s, you're noticing the automobile has become very widespread. And so now middle and even lower class Americans economically can afford to live in surrounding areas, don't have to live in the city center anymore. And that process has accelerated by 1990. And this is typical of most American cities that we see. All right. As this decentralization happens, this movement away of the people from the city center, what we're seeing is large cities are increasingly becoming widely separated, and they basically break up into larger, less connected urban areas. We see different versions of this. All right, so many suburbs have grown to develop kind of their own unique functions and their own urban areas themselves, and even some of these suburbs have developed suburbs of their own. All right, as a result of all of this sprawl. So the first term I want to introduce you to are edge cities. Edge cities are suburbs of a city. Each have their own large residential and business areas of their own. And each edge city is tied together by a beltway, by a highway that usually runs like a ring around the main city itself. Houston is a good example of a city that has a ring road. And then you have all these edge cities that are popped up on the ring road that surrounds the city center. All right, well, each of these edge cities has become so large, some of them have become so large and prominent, they have massive amounts of residences, and they now have their own business center or CBD as well. It's a suburb that's really focused on residences and businesses that employ those particular residents. Another example of decentralization occurring as a result of sprawl is something called an exurb. An exurb is a suburb, but it's further away from the city. It's kind of a suburb of a suburb. This is normally in a more rural area, but it's definitely still within driving distance of cities. Exurbs have become very, very popular, especially in areas with a lot of sprawl, because it allows folks to live in a relatively rural area but still have access to the city itself. And then finally, I want to introduce you to one more term here in this presentation. That's a boomburg. A boomburg is a suburb, right? So one of these communities on the outer edges of a main city that is growing so rapidly, right? Usually it's grown by, it has 100,000 people or more, and most of that growth has occurred within the last 15 years, especially 10 is usually the measure. A lot of cities in Texas, especially outside of Dallas and Houston, are great examples of boomburgs because Texas has grown so rapidly. Okay? Anyways, let's take a look at Vegas here to look at MDC sprawl. It's a little bit of a different deal. So in 1973, this is Las Vegas, right? The green are the developed areas. There's virtually nothing there. All right. And by 2000, right, the landscape is so different. Look at this image on the right. It shows you the residential areas, all right, that exist within the city, or I should say the city limits themselves. Look at how massive that growth has been. That's sprawl, folks. These are residential areas further and further and further outward. Well, here's the deal with that. By the way, here's Truth 2006 already. Look at that, even more sprawl. The rate at which it's happening in some American cities is incredible, especially cities that don't have a lot of natural physical barriers, right? Like mountains or oceans. And of course, what's some of the ramifications of this growth? By the way, this is what sprawl looks like. These are all residences. These are different subdivisions that have been built on the outer edges of Las Vegas, and the new ones just continue to be built further and further and further outward. Think about the water usage, right, that occurs on the lawns of every one of these various homes. Think about the golf courses and the other amenities that are built to accommodate these suburbs. The suburbs are gorgeous, right? But they come with some trade-offs, and we have to acknowledge these massive trade-offs that come with them. By the way, think about the impact that some of this growth has on cities environmentally. Like in the West, we have to think about the impact drought, right, and water usage has. Here, the Hoover Dam and Lake Mead are providing most of the fresh water for the Las Vegas area, right? In 2000, there's your water level. 2004, right, look at where it's decreased to. We are down, right, by something like, 18 meters, right? So that's what, 50 feet. In terms of where the water levels are in just a few years. Golf courses. Look at how much of that water goes towards golf courses. This is pretty incredible. Those green areas all along here are just golf courses that are being accessed by the folks of Las Vegas. And look at that growth, right? You notice how it happened to that water there? Can we go back to that? Look at what happens to the water. Hopefully I can show that again. Boom. All right. My goodness. That's a little, nerve-inducing. Now, admittedly, right, we've had droughts at various times here or there, which can influence certain images. But the long story here is we're massively consuming our fresh water at a rate that is sometimes unsustainable as a result of some of this residential suburban sprawl in the United States. Okay, I think that's going to do it for us. If I'm not mistaken, that's going to wrap up the presentation. Thanks, everybody. This was a good one. It was a long one. This is going to take us through week 11. Have a wonderful, wonderful week.